I have an old friend who used to say, if people knew what awakening really was, they wouldn't want it. What a bold thing to say, especially to the millions of people that are actively seeking freedom and know in their hearts that it's something that they feel pushed towards, pulled towards. Maybe you're one of them. But it can seem like such a paradoxical journey and is often riddled with fear about letting go. People often bump up against that fear, even though they want the freedom. If people really knew what awakening was, they wouldn't want it, he used to say. And that was speaking largely to the many, many, many people that have some grasp that awakening isn't at its core simply about improving one's life circumstances. Awakening frequently does improve people's life circumstances, but that is a secondary corollary effect. What his phrase really spoke to is the fact that when awakening to truth and beginning to accept truth, that process isn't really possible without relinquishing what is untrue. And it's that relinquishment that people become afraid of. The journey to awakening is often described as a journey towards the recognition that that individuated sense of a personal self inside isn't true. It doesn't really exist in the way people usually think. And so they get this idea in their head that if they were to relinquish that sense of self, their entire life will fall apart. And that is at the heart of what he meant when he said, if people really knew what this was, they wouldn't want it. Because as they begin to approach that awareness, that knowledge, they begin to fear their life falling apart. But here's the thing. When that sense of self begins to crumble, when it begins to be seen through, the giving up of it isn't experienced as a loss of something valuable. We only experience a sense of loss when our perception is that what is gone was of great value to us. That's when we feel a sense of loss. But in the awakening journey, what actually happens is that one begins to see that that sense of self isn't actually so valuable. In fact, it can begin to be seen as nothingness. It's often referred to as an illusion. And if something is an illusion, it doesn't have real reality. It's a figment. And if something is a figment, an illusion, then it doesn't have any real being. It is literally nothingness appearing as something, but ultimately still nothing. And if something is fundamentally nothing, then if it appears to go, there cannot be a sense of loss in that because it was recognized as nothing to begin with. And how could there be a sense of loss if what is relinquished was seen to be nothing in the first place? And so in its place floods in that freedom from the burdens of that self or seeming self. I understand very clearly, and I certainly experienced directly myself, a period in which there was sort of a growing sense of the truth of all of that, glimpses into and a growing sense of how that sense of an individuated self is actually a fiction. And I can't deny in the course of my own journey in that there were a lot of moments of fear. There were times in which I looked at my own life and thought, what am I doing? There were times when I thought, I seem to be losing. But even then, even though it often set up a sense, sometimes a sense of panic inside me. And yet, the more that progressed and the more that progressed, and I can't claim that it was always easy. It wasn't. But again, in the end, one begins to see that one's actually relinquishing nothing. And so there could not possibly be a sense of loss in it. If it's nothing, it has no real value. And again, if you lose something without any real value, there couldn't be a sense of loss. So I can understand the fear of that passage, and it's a fear that I'm sure many are experiencing. And for those, I hope you'll hear this message. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. All the things that have gotten you to this point, all the inquiry, all the quietude, and all the things that you've done to show yourself these things, there'll come a time when those are no longer necessary to be doing. As the saying goes, once the journey has finished, the boat that carried you on the journey is no longer necessary. So that's when you set it aside. And when that time comes, it's not with a sense of sacrifice or a sense of loss at all. Because you will be relinquishing what you realize had no inherent value in the first place. There are times when it may seem like a journey in a far country. It may seem like you've had to go through a desert, but it's still a pathway that brings you home. Every single traveler takes their own path. For some, their lives will change dramatically when they get to the other side of this passage. I think those are probably relatively rare cases. For most people, what they find is that their life continues on, much like it was before. It just does so in a way that's much more peaceful, because they look upon all the things in their life from the standpoint of that peace that they find when that individuated sense of self is relinquished. And they get to live from the peace that pours forth from that. And what does that look like other than something that's quite loving? Since what else could there be as a default setting other than something peaceful? And if it's emanating from peace, how could it not be loving? So we continue on, dressed in the clothing of having a personal self. Since that's how this dimension is set up, we just know that it's not true. That clothing isn't us. That clothing isn't the source of that peace. It's why St. Francis said, we wear the ego as a light garment. And if people really knew what awakening was, they couldn't possibly not bend towards it. Peace be with you, my friends. Here's walking in spirit. Maybe I'll see you on the trail sometime. Peace.